Hello, my name is Bernold. Welcome to the best channel about books on the internet. I've got some great stuff for you today. It's about Edgar Allan Poe's great story, The Telltale Heart, in which an old man is murdered because he is ugly. I've conducted a scientific experiment to prove what the story is really about. I've also recreated the final scene using the latest high-tech trickery. You will love it. But let's start with another story. Do you know the Simpsons episode Lisa's Rival? It's the second episode of the 6th season, from the good old days when the Simpsons were still funny. In this episode, a new girl comes to school. Her name is Allison, and she's not only Lisa's equal in intelligence and talent, she's even superior. Lisa wants to make friends with Allison straight away, but their friendship quickly turns into rivalry. It finally comes to a head at the annual diorama competition. In order to win, Lisa instructs Bart to make Allison's diorama disappear. And now guess what the theme of Allison's diorama was that Lisa was so afraid of in the competition. That's right, Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. I loved Allison's diorama so much that I made my own version of it. How do you like it? It took me months to build this diorama. I admit I'm a bit proud. If you don't know the story about the Telltale Heart, you can always find it on the internet. It's not long. You can also find lots of audio versions of it on YouTube, including one with Christopher Lee as the narrator. I'm sure you know Christopher Lee from classic films like The Curse of Frankenstein, The Hands of Orlok, or Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, or maybe from lesser known films like Lord of the Rings, whatever that is. Here's a quick summary. In The Telltale Heart, a crazed guy, it's probably a guy we don't know for sure, tells how he killed an old man who was his housemate. We don't find out why the two lived in the same house, but it doesn't seem like they were crazy together. The narrator does say that he liked the old man, but one thing about him bothered him so much that he decided to kill him. His ugly, evil eye. I know that sounds crazy, and the narrator seems very crazy to me too, even though he keeps emphasizing that he's not. Every night he goes into the old man's room with a lantern, but the old man always has his ugly eye closed, which prevents the narrator from murdering him. Finally, on the 8th night, he finds the eye open, so the narrator kills the old man. He then buries his victim's body under the floorboards in his room. When he has finished removing the evidence, 3 policemen knock on the front door. They say neighbors have heard screams. The narrator confidently leads the policemen through the house. Finally, they sit down in the old man's room where the narrator had buried his victim. He tells the policeman that the old man is out of town and that the screams were his own because he had a bad dream. The policemen seem quite chilled, but make little effort to leave. However, the longer they stay, the more nervous the narrator becomes, so that he eventually even begins to hear his victim's heartbeat under the floorboards. The pounding gets louder and louder until the narrator screams and confesses what he has done. So that's the story. I know, when I summarize it, it doesn't sound quite as exciting as when Christopher Lee, the star of Circus of Fear, reads it out loud. But at least we all know what it's about now. And as you can see, my diorama, just like Allison's from The Simpsons, depicts the narrator going crazy because the old man's heart is pounding under the floor. Wonderful, isn't it? But now a big question arises. What is this story supposed to say? Is it really about a bloke who kills an old man because of his ugly eye? Or is there more to it? An allegory or something? I've read that early commentators saw the story primarily as horror story. They saw the old man's evil eye as an indication that something supernatural was going on. I like the idea because I like paranormal horror, but I don't find it terribly convincing in this case. The narrator emphasizes so often that he is not insane, that it's hard not to think that he is insane. A modern feminist interpretation says that the narrator is actually a woman who is fed up with the patriarchal oppression of the old man. The murder is therefore a kind of emancipatory act of liberation. Well, I think it's absolutely conceivable that the narrator is a woman. Not very likely, but conceivable. But in my opinion, that wouldn't change much at the heart of the story. Nothing in the text suggests that the old man exerts any kind of dominance over the narrator, or that the two have more in common than the mere fact that they live in the same house. If the narrator were a woman being patronized by the old man, then she would probably have to cook for him. And in that case, she could simply poison him, which is statistically much more likely than engaging him in a risky fight. But let's move on to the obvious interpretation. The narrator is simply completely mad. Poe makes no great secret of this. The narrator only seems to be telling the story at all to make it clear that he is not mad. By explaining how cleverly he committed the murder, he wants to prove that he is not crazy at all, but that he acted much more rationally than he thinks a madman ever could. Some people say that the old man's evil eye reminds the narrator of his madness, so he has to kill him because of it. I want to go one step further. I don't think there was ever a murder. The murder is pure imagination. The story that the narrator told the police, namely that the screams heard by the neighbors came from himself, is the real truth. Why do I think that? Because the fact that he's delusional is exactly what he's trying to hide. The real BS is that he's completely rational and killed someone with cool calculation. And how do I know that? Because I did a scientific experiment. The narrator claims that he buried the old man's body under the floorboards. We also learned that this must have happened on an upper floor, because he writes that he went downstairs when the police knocked on the door. Okay, now let's think for a moment. What happens when you try to bury a body on an upper floor of a house? I tried it out. Last week, my beloved Uncle Fritz passed away in a tragic accident. Schnapps and a chainsaw are a bad combination. Anyway, this fortunately gave me the opportunity to prove my interpretation of the telltale heart. Just like in the story, I was trying to bury a corpse in a house. More specifically, the body of Uncle Fritz on the first floor of my house, in a spot directly above my living room. To document what happens, I filmed the living room during my experiment. This is the test setup. So, this spot here is directly above my living room. I will then try to bury Uncle Fritz here. So I will now place my phone on the dining table. Oh, I need to put something behind it. I can assume that you understand the experimental setup, right? I'm never so sure about humans. Bears have so much better brains. Now take a close look at what happened after I removed the floorboards and tried to give Uncle Fritz his final resting place. Uncle Fritz is coming. See? That's what happens when you try to bury someone on the first floor of a house. So the narrator of the telltale heart couldn't have buried anyone in the old man's room. Presumably there was no old man at all, no evil eye, and, of course, no heart beating under the floorboards. All of this is just a fantasy story, a rationalization to avoid having to admit what hurts the narrator the most, that he's insane. Incidentally, in the Simpsons episode about Lisa's rival Principal Skinner was not at all impressed by Allison's diorama about the telltale heart. He said it was a bit sterile and offered no real insight. As an observant bear, I naturally incorporated his criticism into my diorama. To make it less sterile, it's made up of lots of oblique angles, like in those ancient German expressionist films. The oblique angles represent the narrator's madness. I also gave the narrator an evil eye, which symbolizes my interpretation of the story. There never was an old man with an eye like that. The events that the narrator describes to us are nothing other than an expression of his own madness. So that's it. If you like this video, click like, share and subscribe. And press your belly button. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean, but all YouTubers say it. Finally, I have a question for you. Did my interpretation of the telltale heart convince you? Or have I missed something? Or do you perhaps have a completely different idea of what the story is trying to tell us? I'm not just asking because of the YouTube algorithm, because many comments ensure that the video is ranked higher. No. I'm really extremely curious about your answers. I really am. I swear. Bye.